After about 5 years of using Fujifilm gear, swapping out cameras and lenses countless times, I feel like I finally settled on a set of lenses after years of trial and error. So in today's episode, I'm going to talk about those very lenses and how I use them for my street photography and professional work as well. It's worth noting that all of this gear has been gathered over the course of 5 years. When I first started photography, I didn't have the money to be spending on expensive cameras and expensive lenses. So I know how it is for those of you starting out. It is tough and camera gear can be really expensive. Most of the gear has been brought with the money I've earned doing photography. And finally, when it comes to gear and stuff, you do not need all of this gear to be a photographer or even a professional photographer. And lastly, this episode is sponsored by none other than me. All the photos you see in this video have been edited using my preset pack. I'll drop the links to that down below in the description. Also, if you haven't already, hit that thumbs up button and subscribe as well. Alright, so first up, let's talk about the lenses I use for street photography. When I go out to shoot street, I'm almost always using a prime lens and a lightweight prime lens at that. So the lenses I use are the 23 f2, the 35mm f1.4, and the 50mm f2. So the 35mm f1.4 here in my hand is the lens I've used most over the last 12 months. I picked it up last year in January, and I just really love the 35mm focal range. I feel like I'm able to pick out my subject while still retaining enough of the background to give the photo some context. From my experience using this 35 1.4 and my experience using loads of Fujifilm lenses over the years, I feel like the 35-1.4 delivers some of the most pleasing images on the eye. It's not necessarily the sharpest lens or the crispest lens out there, but the photos taken with it just have a really nice, pleasing look to them, especially the way it renders highlights and out of focus background areas. I've also used the 35 f2. I used that for years before picking up this 35 1.4. I really do love that lens. It is a really good lens. One of the main reasons why I went from the 35 f2 to the 35 1.4 was because I started doing more and more street photography at nighttime. And having that fast aperture going from f2 to f1.4 really does make a big difference when you're shooting at nighttime. Now that said, the 35 f2, really good lens. The autofocusing is better. It's also weather sealed as well, and it's also a lot cheaper. So if you're starting out and you are looking to save a bit of money, go for that 35 f2 instead of the f1.4. There's also the 33mm f1.4, which is one of Fujifilm's newer lenses. It's sharper, the autofocusing is better, and it's weather sealed as well. So at the moment, I'm happy with the 35 1.4. I'm not thinking of upgrading unless Fujifilm drop an insane promotion that makes it impossible to resist. Next up is the 50mm f2, which was one of the first Fujifilm lenses I picked up. I absolutely love this lens, and I love the 50mm focal length for street photography. You can really get that cinematic feel to your shots when you shoot at 50mm because it's really easy to generate that separation between your subject and the background. It's lightweight, relatively inexpensive, has really fast autofocusing, also really good for portraits and product photography as well. Alright, so on to the 23mm f2. Again, one of the first lenses I brought for Fujifilm, and it's actually a focal length I've been using less and less in recent years. I find that the 23mm focal length is a bit wide for my type of street photography, where I'm looking to pick out the subjects a bit. But I go through phases, sometimes I love shooting 35, sometimes I love shooting 50, and sometimes I like shooting with the 23. So it's a lens I always keep around. It's also really light and small, so when I go traveling or if I head out, I can just stick it in my pocket or into a small bag. Also worth noting that the 23mm focal length is really good if you're in tight locations like marketplaces or cities where there's lots of high-rise buildings. There's also the 23mm f1.4, which is coming out really soon from Fujifilm. I'm going to talk about that lens in a bit more detail later on in this episode. So those are the lenses I use for my street photography. Now I'm going to talk about the lenses I take with me when I go traveling. It's worth remembering that while traveling, you're only going to have a couple of hours or at best a couple of days in a specific location. So I base my kit around being able to capture as much as I can in a short amount of time, both video and photography, while also being as lightweight as possible. So my favorite lens when it comes to traveling is the Fujifilm 16-55 f2.8. Now, in my opinion, this is the ultimate all-rounder, especially when you pair it with the X-T4. It's lightweight, it's weather resistant, not too heavy, and covers a really handy focal range as well. So I also use the 16-55 for a lot of my commercial work, both video and photography, and that lens is filming this episode right now. In fact, all of my YouTube episodes are filmed using the 16-55, which is on the X-T4. Next up, the 55-200. I use this lens mostly for B-roll. I picked this up while I was in Japan a couple years back, and I was really happy with the video got out of it. I also shot some of my favorite shots on that trip with this lens, so a really handy lens. It is a bit big and bulky, so I rarely take it out with me in London, and when I go traveling, the only time I take it with me is if I'm driving somewhere or if I'm not going to be walking around all day. And finally, I've got the Fujifilm 10-24mm f4. Now this is a zoom lens I've been using less and less in recent years, and that's mainly because my photography style has changed. I went from doing more cityscapes and architectural shots to doing more street photography. And obviously this isn't really a focal range you'll use for street. It is, however, a really handy focal range, and when I'm doing commercial work indoors, architectural stuff, capturing interiors, and also video, this lens comes in really handy. So it is a good lens, but to be honest, I used to have the 14mm f2.8, and I do miss that lens. It's also half the size and a lot lighter. So maybe in the near future I might switch back, or just wait for Fujifilm to make a new version of that 14-2.8. So they're the lenses I use for my street and travel. There is one lens I am thinking of buying when it does come out, and that's the 23mm f1.4. The 23-14 was announced late last year by Fujifilm. You can pre-order it now, and it costs around £800. So the main reason I have my eye on the 23mm f1.4 is because the wider a lens gets, the harder it becomes to separate your subject from the background. And I feel for both my street photography and professional work, having that faster aperture at 1.4 will make a big difference. Also, as of late, I've been shooting more and more at night time, and having the faster aperture at 1.4 is going to make a big difference compared to shooting at the 23mm f2. It's also important to note that these new Fujifilm lenses are designed to work with camera sensors with a much higher megapixel count. So when the X-T5 comes out, or the X-H2, the X Pro 4, these are going to use Fujifilm's new sensor, which probably is going to have a much larger megapixel count. So that's my Fujifilm lens lineup after years of trial and error. If you are thinking of buying any of these lenses, I've dropped the links to all of them down below in the description. That said, I'll probably wait until Fujifilm drop one of their cashback promotional deals. They normally do it 2 or 3 times a year, and that way you can save yourself a lot of money. Finally, if you found this episode helpful, you can do me a massive favor by hitting that thumbs up button. It just helps this episode get out to more and more people. And if you have any questions about any of the gear or any Fujifilm gear, drop them down in the comments and I'll make sure to get back to you. A huge thanks for watching and the support. Stay safe, and I'll catch you in the next one.